Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're going to be doing another weekly installment of the top performing historic decks, weekly meta update. So what we do is each week we look at the top performing decks on the Arena ladder, and we look at the data sets coming from Untapped GG, which is a companion tool that runs alongside your Arena client, tracks your win rates as well as others, aggregates it into a bunch of stats, tracks your collection, as well as provides you suggestions for decks and stuff you can build. So really good tool, and it's something you could definitely you definitely want to try out if you are using Arena. It's free to get started with it. The link is in the video description down below if you do want to jump on that. As always with these, I will post a bunch of these deck lists in the video description comments or section, so you can pull those lists, import them right into Arena if you want to get started on any of these. And before we jump in, as always, if you do enjoy this content, greatly appreciate it if you can. Drop a like and a comment on the video. If you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button. In addition to these meta videos, we do a bunch of gameplay for a bunch of these decks as well on the channel. So for this week, we are looking historic. We're looking at both best of 1 and best of 3. Best of 1 from March 8th through 15th, Platinum to Mythic rank, 46,000 games of Magic played. And jumping right into it, top performing deck of the week is Mono Green Elves, which is actually pretty impressive. Almost 70% win rate, 110 games. This is pretty stock. They're playing one Freyalise in here into Craterhoof Behemoth at the top end. You can search for it. So they actually only have one Fierce Empath as the search effect. Sometimes you'll see a couple more copies of the Fierce Empath, but otherwise, this version here, just playing your tribal lords, make a bunch of mana, pump it into either Elvish Warmaster or Allosaurus Shepherd to combo kill your opponent. So something cool like you can see with Untapped, I don't have a bunch of the Elves cards. So if I want to build this deck, I need 7 rares and 4 mythics. I have 12 and 14 respectively. So it kind of gives you an idea with that. These decks usually can kill very quickly, so they are popular. I usually don't like playing decks that just have you dead to pretty much a single sweeper, but this deck can usually just go so fast sometimes against control that turn 4 is not fast enough. But Mono Green Elves. Next up is Selesnya Squirrel Twin, Selesnya Heliod combo, 62% win rate. So really this deck here has seen quite a few variations, or even variations is probably a fair word, but it's consistently been one of the top decks in best of 1. The combination of Scurry Oak, Heliod, and any sort of enter the battlefield gain life effect, so any of these effects here, lets you infinitely loop where you gain infinite life, create infinite tokens, and you just gotta click, 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 and you kind of go from there. You have the backup plan with Trelasara and Voice of the Blessed that make just larger creatures. And then this particular version is doing a split of Ranger-Captain of Eos and Skyclave. Ranger-Captain lets you toolbox and lets you find some of your 1-drops, including Selfless Savior, as another protection style spell. And this kind of wraps up in a Collected Company shell. This version of the mana base, you're seeing a Forsaken Crossroad, Overgrown Farmland, and some creature lands, or some Castle Ardenvales mixed in. Next up, a Mono Red Aggro. So this particular version, it's been around in some variations. Some are on Torbrand, some aren't. Some, like my version, prefers Chandra just because it interacts with the board when you don't have an existing board state. But this version here is actually trying out Kumana, Faces Caxton. All modes are super relevant in this deck. Lets you buff up these other creatures, like even turn 2, 3/3 Robber the Rich seems sweet. So lets you kind of combat like that. And then with this particular version, you still have your Rampaging Ferocidons, you still have your Roiling Vortex to push through any of that additional damage. To be honest, I'd probably cut down one of these and play one more of these. The Legendary, it's a 4-drop. This just shuts down like the Heliod deck and does a lot of incidental damage as well. Even like Bone Crusher, I'd probably have more copies of Bone Crusher personally. Just being able to interact with your opponent's board is important sometimes. Coming in next, Mardu Vehicles. This is the Greasefang Parhelion kind of combo deck. So basically what you're trying to do with this deck is self-mill yourself loot effects. So Faithless Looting, Goblin Engineer can search up copies of Parhelion. Thrilling Discovery lets you find copies as well. And then you basically use this Greasefang to reanimate Parhelion as early as turn 3, and then attack for 13 damage. So it's kind of a combo kill graveyard strategy. You could technically Magic Christmas line with this deck. So if you Faithless Looting on 1, and you bin both Greasefang and Parhelion, you can Can't Stay Awake your copy of Greasefang and get it out on turn 2. While potential, it's not like a guarantee, but kind of another way to look at it. Azorius Control, blue-white Teferi. So kind of from the weekend, we saw some copies in some at the Neon Dynasty Championship. The primary decks were like Teferi-based Control, Phoenix, and food decks. There's a couple different flavors of Control, but we're seeing a lot of the decks adapt and play copies of the Wandering Emperor in the main board. Instant speed, both removal, threat, win con. This version, you got some sensors in it. March of the Otherworldly Lights, another card that a lot of these decks are playing. This one's only 2 Faithful Absence, but just another 1 mana flexible removal spell, hitting artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. This version's opting for Divine Purge as the primary sweeper to slow things down, and then only 1 copy of Wrath of God and 1 copy of Farewell. So looking more of a delay and then eventually just take over. 3 copies of Teferi, 2 of Narset. You got some of the utility lands, some halls, and then some castles as well in the mana base. And best of one, you're also seeing like Soul Guide. It's pretty low cost to play Soul Guide. It houses some decks like the Greasefang deck or any sort of Reanimator deck. If worst case you don't need it, you just cycle it away. And a lot of this deck plays at instant speed as well. Boros Burn. So this is basically Boros in the sense that you use Luris Companion and you can play Lightning Helix. And then this one here, you're just throwing a bunch of burn spells. You have a Wizard's package of Soulscar Mage, Yoshino, and likely Lava Runner. Some Kumanos as well mixed in there. And then Electrostatic Blast provides you card advantage to kind of burn out your opponent in that regard. So that's best of one, kind of the top decks. For best of 3, 16,000 matches. So important matches could be 2 to 3 games long. So something to factor in. And kind of the surprise deck, like, is this 2020? These are like my old MIQ days playing this deck. This is pretty stock Gruul. So this was a list that a couple pros brought to the Neon Dynasty. Nothing really new with this deck. Like you got your Llanowar Elves Pelt Collector, your 2-drops BTE, Voltaic Brawler, Ooze. This gets around blockers, just smash in, opting for Questing Beast over Collected Company to deal with the Planeswalkers, and then 3 Ember Cleaves. You get some Bazejus and Sokuzens. Excuse me. Some Dens, Lairs, so heavier on the creature lands to kind of push through. Sideboard, you got like removal, Flame Blessed Bolt to Braid, Ooze to eat graveyards, Rex Sage for like enchantments decks, more against like the grindier control decks, and then against the creature mirrors. Having played a lot of Gruul in the past, especially with Jim Davis doing so well on auras, this deck sucks against the auras. You have such a hard matchup. You have a very small window where you can hit their creatures before they get suited up with burn. If not, you usually lose. I was playing the 4-mana enchantment that steals a creature and then kills tapped creatures and force the Saga. That's how I, in the past, would combat that matchup. It's usually a pretty bad matchup. Like, you can get blockers out of the way, but they usually can gain a lot of life, especially it being blue-white as opposed to the Orzhov version, which tends to not get as large. But I'm happy if Embercleave comes back. I don't know about you. Up next, Azorius Control. So this is a Yorion version of the deck that we saw. And this version here, you got the full 4 of Wandering Emperors, using Omen of the Sea for some utility, Blink, same with Portable Holes, March is in there. So very similar, just you get more space, so you add more cards. And then you got like Hermits for the counter wars, some Baneslayer Angels versus the aggressive decks as well. And then we have, it's just a lot of different flavors of Azorius in best of 3 this go around. We have the Affinity deck, so Artifacts deck. So one thing to note, like This version's not on Divine Purge. It is on Farewell, which just kind of hoses. The best one version had some Divine Purges, but using like Ingenious Smith to kind of toolbox yourself in a way, look at the top few cards. Esper Sentinel draws you a bunch of cards. You have a lot of utility artifacts here. Nettlecyst gets very large in this deck. You can give it Trample with Shadow Sphere, and then you also have Thought Monitor that draws you a bunch of cards. And then your sideboard plan, you got some size to make you go wide, and just some more utility spells in there. Lastly, Azorius Auras. So this deck is at 64% win rate. This was Jim Davis's list from the... Actually, no, this isn't Jim Davis's. So some of the versions are playing Light Paws that can tutor you up. So when you cast an aura, it lets you go find an aura. So it lets you play some one-ofs. So you can play fewer copies of key cards like Aether Tunnel, Arcane Flight, Curious Obsession, and then just go and find them. Also, like if you need to get blockers out of the way, Heliod's Punishment, stuff like that. Esper Sentinel in this deck draws you some cards as well. And then you just have like utility spells here in the graveyard, depending on the matchups. If you need to protect yourself against like Red Burn or like Red Based Removal against Phoenix, this blocks Phoenix for days. And then you kind of play around in that regard. So that's it for the weekly meta installment. As always, if you do want to see any of these decks in action, you could check my profile under the historic. I've played some of these. You can obviously tell, like with this deck, I haven't because I don't own all the cards. I've played some blue-white in the past, stuff like that. I'm generally more fond of the aggressive-based decks. In the past, I've done very well with them. But you could definitely check that out on my account. As always, if you do want to see my profile is always public here on Untapped. So if you want to see what I'm playing, you could just look up that. Bant Wolf Run happens to be my arena name, but you can see like all the games I've played, highest rank I've made for the month. I played a lot of Alchemy this month with enchantments. I've been enjoying that deck, but I kind of screw around with decks here and there. You can kind of see. Been doing some limited as well, trying to get double mythic this month, but let me know what you think. Catch you next time. Thanks for watching. Have a great one. Stay safe out there.